All right. Can somebody please confirm that they can see the heading?
That's great.
Title page here. Perfect. All right. Thank you very much. And well, this is meant to be, a discussion. So please, if there are questions, I would love to hear from you. So I'm going to kind of walk through. I got a few slides here to kind of guide the discussion. But again, I want this to be something that is interactive. So if you have questions, please interrupt at any time. Cash management, I'm sure it's a very important topic right now with many things like in 2020 where everything is ever changing, and just maybe might be some challenging times for a lot of organizations, including churches and other religious organizations. So just here a little bit of a terminology. The cash management, what is it? It involves, of course, the collecting, handling, and usage of cash. It also includes concepts such as liquidity, cash flow, and investing. So just a few things that I wanted to go through and talk about. And again, please interrupt at any time if you have some questions and want to ask specific questions maybe on your organization. But just some things to think about related to cash management and the timing and the methodology of your cash management is, when do you collect cash? How are you collecting it? And are you changing the methods, particularly during COVID here? I know a lot of churches and other organizations already had gone to online giving, but if you haven't done that, have you thought about that during COVID here? I was just in a breakout session with a few people, and I believe Mark Felton and Kimberly Sherwood, they were talking about push pay. They use push pay. And is that something that you can use to help manage your cash and maybe increase not only the sheer dollar amounts that are coming in, but can you maybe speed up collections as well? So if you have maybe certain times of the year when you have cash crunches, are you looking at the timing and the methodologies of your cash collections to maybe alleviate some of those cash flow concerns throughout the year? Similarly, when do you use it and spend it? I think that's just part of managing your cash. What are your expenses generally flat throughout the year? So it's roughly 1/12 of your expenses each month, or do you have really high expenses early in the year, which makes cash flow an issue at the beginning of the year? Again, what can you do to make the incoming cash kind of cover that if you have those expenses much earlier in the year? And then, just are there any cash flow crunches at any point? Is it always at the end of the first quarter? Is it before the holidays? Is it, okay, we're flush after the holidays when people seem to give a lot of money? But just thinking about the timing of when you bring in your cash, when you spend it, how you're bringing it in, so that you can hopefully manage your cash flows and reduce the likelihood or how much you need to use things like a line of credit or other borrowings. Just something that gets, I think, pretty synonymous with cash management a lot of times is liquidity. So just thinking about checking accounts, savings accounts, any money market accounts, of course, being very liquid, and that can be a good thing. So you have cash available, but also should you be investing it more? And we can talk about that more in just a second. So one of the things that I like to always ask, particularly with churches, is how many bank accounts do you have? We see a lot of times there can be dozens of bank accounts, and is that really necessary? And I would argue that there are better ways to track restricted dollars. I think a lot of times there's various bank accounts that are on hand that a lot of times are to track certain pots of money that are restricted for different purposes. And there's different ways that you can track that, which might make it a lot easier for your cash management and just frankly for keeping the books and reconciling the books if you have fewer cash accounts. And then also just something for managing your cash, and this is maybe somewhat internal control related, is do you have all of the accounts on the books? Quite often we see that there is a cemetery account or there's some sort of auxiliary group maybe that handles their own account, and that is not on the books. And that, of course, can be dangerous for just knowing how much cash you have, managing your cash, and then just from an internal control perspective as well, to make sure that all of your cash is safeguarded and being spent on appropriate reasons. Something else for liquidity: CDs, certificates of deposit. Of course, there is another way to keep that money relatively liquid and maybe earn a little bit more of a return on it while not getting into the stock market game. And then lastly, just investments. I think we see a lot of times there's a lot of money in cash accounts that are earning little to no interest, and just what can you do to balance liquidity with investment return, and realizing that different organizations have different tolerances for risk. But if you have a pile of cash that is always sitting in your cash accounts earning you nothing, are there investments that you could be putting a certain chunk of that into, which will earn you a return? And maybe even if you're very risk adverse, can you invest that in some investments that are just very low risk, that at least gets you some return? So thinking about that investment mix, and then do you want a policy for how you are going to be invested, just the types of investments and how much risk you're willing to take. And then just thinking about endowments too. I know a lot of organizations, whether they're churches or not, have endowments, and just recognizing that those should not be touched for operational purposes. So whether those are in liquid funds or not, just not counting on those to be used for operating purposes. Any questions? Feel free. Anyone wants to jump in? Otherwise, I'll just keep rolling. Just another thing that we think of a lot with cash management, just a reserve. Like, how much should you keep on hand? And I think this is something that we talk about quite a bit with our clients, particularly a lot of times when we're doing board presentations and such too, is just what are your reserves, and how much of your reserve is cash, or cash and investments are liquid reserves. And just some things to think about along those lines is, what are your annual or monthly expenses? And then how many months, for example, do you want to have on hand in a liquid reserve? Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? So not that, God willing, a COVID's not going to happen every year, but just when you're setting aside these reserves for when unforeseen things happen, such as a decrease in revenue because of a pandemic, or maybe increased expenses because of a pandemic, because of buying PPE and other things. So just thinking about what are your annual or monthly expenses. You can, if you're operating on a accrual basis and you do record depreciation on your fixed assets, your property and equipment, excluding that. So looking at cash type expenses, and then maybe considering other things like your debt principal payments on a monthly basis, and maybe any capital purchases that you're planning too, and just thinking what are going to be our cash expenses, or our cash outlays for the next month, 3 months, 6 months, year, whatever it may be, and just how do your liquid reserves correlate with those expected outlays. So we like to say, hopefully you have at least 3 months on hand. Some organizations want to have much more than that. They develop an operating reserve. They can maybe develop reserves for other purposes as well. But just these are things to think about when you want to develop and have adequate reserves on hand and liquid reserves on hand, so that you can meet your obligations as they come due. I mentioned that. Yes.
I have one question, just in terms of how many months is a best practice for setting aside a reserve?
Yeah. I think 3 to 6 months is kind of a rule of thumb as a good spot to be. Some organizations shoot for a lot more than that. Some would love to get to 3 months, and I realize that it varies depending on size of budget and various other things. But yeah, I think 3 to 6 months is a good goal to shoot for having that liquid reserve, so that maybe you're you don't, if you have somebody could argue there's too much, then, could you be using your money on more mission, giving it to other purposes, or reinvesting it in the organization, investing it into facilities, various other things. So looking at a variety of things, but I think 3 to 6 months is kind of a rule of thumb. And of course, I mentioned here the last 2 bullets too. Just this ties in with liquidity. You want to have reserves on hand. Maybe you want to have a year's worth of reserves, but maybe you only need 3 months to be truly liquid, and the rest of it you can invest in other things that you kind of set aside, and your goal is to not touch that. And then final thing that I have, which I've done many sessions on before, which can easily be its own session for a few hours. But just when you think of cash management, I think a lot of times we think of the previous things: liquidity, having enough cash on hand for day to day or month to month, investing, and other things like that. But cash management, as going back to my first slide, includes the kind of the handling of it. So the internal controls around it too. So just think about that as well as part of your cash management. I know a lot of times when we do work with churches and other nonprofits is we spend a lot of times looking at internal controls and how can we improve those so that the money coming in gets to the bank and the money going out is only going to the appropriate payees. So think about how you're handling cash. Do you have adequate controls over things like offertory and counting the actual collections, maybe on the weekends, and maybe actual true cash, not just checks? Do you have good controls over that? Do you have unrelated count teams, things like that? Do you have controls over income coming through the mail? That I would expect to be largely checks, of course, but just making sure that those aren't somehow taken by somebody opening the mail. Do you have good controls over your expenditures, your checks? Who's cutting checks? Who's recording transactions? Who's signing checks? Who mails the checks? Just segregating those duties. Payroll, do you have good controls over the payroll? Same thing, to have checks and balances in place there so that the same person isn't running payroll or submitting payroll to a third party and then also reviewing the reporting from it. There should be multiple people involved. And then credit cards. Unfortunately, this is a place or an area where I have done a few fraud examinations over the years for churches where there was misuse of credit cards. So making sure that all credit cards are reviewed by somebody else, that all of the receipts are obtained and attached, and just making sure that all of those charges are legitimate organizational charges. So that's a real quick rundown of various kind of areas to think about for cash management. Be happy to entertain any questions that we have at this time on these topics or just anything else related to the topic.
One of the questions we had come in, as I read this, feel free to raise your hand. There's little buttons at the bottom, enter it in the chat, or just unmute yourself. We'd love to hear your questions. The one question I had come in, Mike, is do you have any sample internal control documents for all of the items that you just showed?
We do have some information out on our website. We have all sorts of sample documents out there. So if you want to go to, sorry, I thought we were getting another question there. You go to www.wagnercpas.com on the bottom of my slide there, and go under nonprofits, and under resources, there's a variety of different sample documents out there. And if there isn't something that drills down on exactly what you need, if you're looking for something in a certain area that isn't specific enough, please reach out to me just outside of the presentation here, and I'd be happy to share maybe something that's not on the website, or even something that I've seen from other clients that we can, of course, take out any client-specific information from, but sharing actual samples that other organizations are using, I'd be happy to do that too.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. And Hannah just included the link to all those resources on our website, so make sure to check that out. So now we move on to our second presenter, if you're all done, Mike.
Yeah, if there's no other questions, we can turn it over to Kevin, right?
Yes.
All right.
Thanks, Mike. I will share my screen here. Whoops. Can you unshare yours, Mike? I can't start yet. Or someone else. Can you pass me? Well, I will start, but if, there we go. Now I can share. All right, so a good friend of mine from Nashville about a year ago got a call in the morning from a local FBI agent. That's never how you want to start your day. And he told him that a church that he's connected to was being hacked by China and that their confidential data was being sent overseas. Again, really bad way to start your morning. But Charles is a pretty down-to-earth, stable guy, so he didn't freak out too much. He was able to work with his church. They were not a client of his, but they were able to work with the church to figure out what had happened. And after a few days of investigation, they found out that a media tech staff member had a server online from years ago that really wasn't in use anymore, but it was sending data off to China. Wasn't protected, wasn't hardened. There was no security software at all. And why is this bad? Well, first of all, it does just sound bad. You don't want to send your data anywhere, much less to a foreign country. But even worse, the church had missionaries and groups in China that they support that could be compromised. So there are some things that Charles was able to fix, for that church. But the story that he was telling me and why Charles shared it with me was realizing that for our nonprofit and faith-based clients and people we know, that we need to make sure that there are some simple things that can be done to make it so that your data, your people, what's important to you is secure and protected. So Charles fixed that issue and made sure that things weren't hacked. But the only reason Charles got a call from that FBI agent that morning, it wasn't that it made the FBI's radar. They get hundreds, if not thousands, of these incidents daily, and they don't have the resources to go through them all. Typically, they deal with the ones that reach in the millions to hundreds of millions of dollars. So what they would consider the big boy breaches, the bigger issues. The reason that Charles got a call is that local field agent went to a church that supported missionaries in China, and he wanted to make sure that things were protected. So he had a personal interest and a personal reason for caring. He then took time out of his workday to make sure that someone would take care of it. And so that's why he contacted Charles, knowing that Charles had interactions with that church and would take care of it. So even though it was too small for the FBI to care about, someone, a person did step in individually and help, get things secure and make sure that the data loss was stopped. So what can you do about this? My goal is not to get all techie. I'm not going to talk geek at all because none of you are network engineers or want that. You want to know what are some simple things that I can do or my church or other faith-based organization can do to help make sure my people, my processes, and my network is secure. It's even more important and harder these days with everyone living it and working at home. Since February and March, our world has turned upside down with how we access our networks. So there are no guarantees. I love talking to faith-based organizations because we have one guarantee there. But as far as information security, I can give you no guarantees that if you do these 1, 10, 100 things that you'll be secure. It's impossible to guarantee that. So, but what I can do is I've been doing information security for almost 30 years. I love it. It's a passion of mine. That may sound really odd to you normal people, but I love keeping what's yours, and making sure that the bad actors can't get into your data and impact your ministries. So I'm going to talk to you about a few things of what you can do to secure your confidential data, to protect your church, to educate your staff, and also be prepared for when, not if, but when a breach happens, because at some point, something will happen. So there's a few things. As Wagner pointed out, slides will be available. And I can get additional information as well. But these are 4 things that you need to do on your computer networks, on your computers and your networks, at a bare minimum. And I chose these because they're not that expensive typically. There are some ways, especially for qualified nonprofit, to get some very good pricing, from a TechSoup or individually for these items, but they will stop a whole lot of the problems you may have. You need a firewall these days. One up. What's called the next generation attacks. All the
Kevin, I can't hear you. I don't know if everybody else can.
Nope, he cut out for me as well.
It looks like he froze.
The beauties of doing virtual events.
He might have to check his network security.
Yeah, right? Oh, looks like we lost him. That's absolutely okay. We can just move on to the next presentation at the end. Oh, we got him back?
So that is one of the downsides of working from home when your home internet is massively overused by all the kids and businesses in the area. So I apologize for that. Thank you, Spectrum. So you need the firewall, I think is where I dropped off. You need to have next generation antivirus and what we call other advanced threat protection software. Just going out and getting one free antivirus these days isn't enough. So antivirus will protect your laptop. They will protect your workstations. They'll protect your servers and all your data. It's needed, and more than just antivirus these days. You need advanced threat detection, abilities to remediate those threats. You need to have DNS protection, which helps from a web browsing security perspective. And so those are some things that you just need to have installed on every computer, Windows and Mac, that you have. Now, speaking of Windows and Macs, one of the best things that you can do, and you can go back for no money and do this today, and you will be so much better protected. You should have your Windows and your Mac computers automatically updating all their security patches either weekly or daily. There is no reason not to set your machines to automatically install them. Every once in a while, you'll have an issue. The attacks that you'll prevent are worth those few issues you'll have. So again, go ahead. Windows and Mac both have the ability to automatically update your machines, and the amount of benefit you'll get is amazing. And the last thing, my guess is that 99.9% of you are either using Gmail or Office 365 for email. If you have a committee or someone on staff or volunteer who set that up, there are some very important things that you can do to protect your environment. You can restrict what countries can log into your email. You can make sure you have multi-factor authentication turned on. You can put visual tags so that you know when an email originates from outside your organization, and you can scan attachments and you can scan links and things like that. Some of them are a little bit complicated to do. Some of them are actually pretty easy to set up. So whomever set up your Office 365 or Gmail environment can probably do a lot of the minimum security standards that you need to do to secure your email environment. What does that do from a, what's the benefit to you? We have a client in Stoughton that prior to becoming a client, they were scammed $1,000 by an email breach, where accounts receivables were sent to a different email address. And so, I think the sum total was about 135,000. Well, they were targeted again earlier this year. And the nice thing, by then they had implemented blocks on what country could log into their email environment, as well as requiring multi-factor authentication. So they did not lose another 6 figures by an email phishing campaign. So securing and protecting, these 4 items, not that hard to do always. A lot of it can be done by whomever has set up what you're doing, but it just needs to be done to protect your data and your people. Speaking of people, this is really important. You need to train your people. You need to train your volunteers. You need to train your staff. Now, the nice thing, since you work for a nonprofit and since you work for a faith-based nonprofit, you actually have a giant advantage typically over a company, small, medium, or big. You typically have trusted and very loyal staff. So the nice thing is when you explain why something's important, why should you care about security, what, by clicking on a bad link, what that can do to you, when they understand the why, they'll care about the what, because they're trusted and they're loyal. So you have a giant plus in that. We've seen that, all the time in our religious organizations that we deal with. But you need to train them ongoing. So do a lunch and learn. There's plenty of free online resources. There's some paid resources where you can do either weekly or monthly phishing simulation attacks so that someone can look at an email and spot whether it's real or malicious. You should, at a minimum, be doing some of that free training. Your staff and your volunteers are your first and last line of defense. I say first because you're training them. You're getting them, actually caring and understanding why security is important. But last is think of a phishing email. When you get an email that is malicious or has a virus attached to it, or if you click a link, it's going to infect your computer, you want the staff not to do that. So they're the last line of defense because somehow that email got through, or somehow a malicious attachment got through. So that's why they're the first and also the last line of defense. Take advantage of your people. It's going to require some time. It will not require much money, but it will require just some time to give ongoing presentations, ongoing trainings, ongoing why this is important. Here's how you spot a phishing email. Here's how you spot a legitimate email and things like that. And we've had great success with nonprofit clients doing these trainings and staff fully understanding why it's important and then what they need to do. And the last thing you need to do is have a plan. Something bad is going to happen. I can tell you that will happen. I was talking to someone in my first breakout session that there are some issues with backups. Something will happen with technology. Technology is not perfect. It is what it is, nor are your people. So have a plan. Have policies and procedures in place. Talk to your HR, whether you have your internal HR or you have outsourced HR. There are some certain policies that you need. You need an acceptable use policy. So what can people do with that computer that they have in the office or at home? A mobile device policy. What are the restrictions you have on someone's cell phone? Can I access the church's data from here or not? You need an incident response policy. What happens when a virus comes? Do people know to shut down the machines immediately? Is there a number that they can call, tech support, a volunteer or a staff member? Do you have a business and disaster recovery plan? So what happens when a server crashes or when data is deleted? That brings up my next point. Back up your data. You need it. Your data belongs to you. And it's critical that you have backups. And that third bullet point, make sure you've tested your backups that they can be restored. You probably wouldn't be surprised. Well, you might be surprised how many times we hear that we have backups, but they've never been tested. There are good companies that can try and recover data, but it's not 100%. So test your backups. That doesn't cost anything beyond a little bit of time. And the last thing that every company needs to have, and I'm not an insurance broker, so don't go to me for a quote, but you need to have cyber liability insurance. At some point, something bad will happen. Someone will click on a link. Someone will go to a website that's infected. Someone will do something intentionally or unintentionally, and you'll lose data, or you'll lose a computer, or something worse will happen. Your files will become encrypted. Cyber liability can help protect you. So you can at least get some money back to restore your data, restore your networks. They can pay for staff time. They can pay for consulting time. It's at almost to the point of, if you're going to be in business with a computer network, you need to have cyber liability insurance. It's definitely needed. So those are the three things. Hopefully you got some benefit out of them. Again, I promised I wouldn't go technical, and that was not my goal of how to do something. More just what's the important things that you need to do to protect your church or other religious nonprofit that you're here with. Secure and protect. Train your people and have a plan. But as I started off, work is required. It may not be a lot. It may be simple, but everything that any of the presenters are going to talk about is going to require time and effort. That's what I have. I think I went a tiny bit over, so I don't know if I have any time for questions, but I can stick around and I'll be in the breakout rooms afterwards, so that if there are any specific questions, Emily, I can answer them then.
Wonderful. I will direct those their way as the other two presenters start. And yes, Kevin will also be in the breakout rooms, so feel free to ask him questions then. So we can move on to our third presentation, which is Hannah.
Hello, everybody. We get to talk more about internal controls. So just a quick reminder that for those of you that joined during maybe the breakout sessions or the first two, that we're going to be sharing just the contact information, first name, last name, and email with those who are in attendance today. So if you don't want that information shared, please message me privately in the Zoom chat or send me an email, and I will not share that. But otherwise, we want to be able to allow you to connect with each other after this day. So our goal at Wagner CPAs is to be able to support our clients in the religious area, and whether you're a church or you're a ministry. And so that's what Faith in Numbers was created to be. And we're doing it virtually this year in two parts. So we'll have today, and then we have another session on December 10th as well, as almost like a part two to today's session. So excited to be here with you today. I'm going to talk about internal controls and just how they have evolved a little bit during this remote COVID environment, and yet still are relevant and needed all the more. So, all right, so what are the purpose of controls? As you know, they are designed to protect your assets, essentially, or create accountability and protect people. So sometimes when we hear the word internal control, it just has this bad connotation that we don't trust our people. But in reality, it's actually designed to be able to allow trustworthy people to be protected and to do their job effectively, and to allow your organization to continue functioning. And so during COVID, we've had to adapt to new working environments. And, some have maintained the in-office experience, but definitely during those first few months, March and April, there was mostly remote environments happening. And that means, who's going to be receiving the mail. We were talking about that in our earlier session, just networking, like somebody's got to go in and get the mail. The mail doesn't stop, and yet no one's in the office. Or, we've had to shut down our Sunday morning services, and now we don't, have an account team anymore, and yet we need to somehow continue to count our offering. So where's the balance between being flexible and at the same time being effective and safe in your internal control environment? Both are still needed during this time. So I want to just kind of show the different elements of an internal control structure as you're thinking through things or having to kind of adapt. These are the 5 elements that we as auditors, we look at in your environment, and something to consider. I can tell you on every audit since March, we've had to evaluate people's or the organization's structures in kind of a new manner and ask what's changed. So the control environment itself is basically your leadership, your mission, your goals. What is your commitment as an organization to integrity? What's the tone at the top? Is there a culture that values internal controls? Things like that. Your risk assessment would be things that maybe what are specific challenges that your organization is facing? What are threats to your organization? What are the risks that you might be facing on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis that you need to be protecting, being aware of? The control activities are actually the controls themselves. So the act of reviewing and approving, the multiple people involved, the segregation of duties is what we would call that. Things reviewing reconciliations, those processes. Information and communication is essentially just how does information get shared in our organization? What's the effectiveness of that? What are we measuring? And who are we telling? And finally, monitoring is basically knowing what control activities are happening and making sure they're happening. So following up on things and having check-in points to make sure that controls are still operating in an effective manner. Besides, maybe some people think the audit time is when that gets evaluated. But in reality, that's something that should happen inside your organization, having a list of the controls and having somebody in charge of checking on those and making sure they're still happening. So I would say that during a COVID environment, the monitoring and the risk assessment are probably at a heightened level of awareness and need because our risks have gone up in this remote environment. We need to increase our monitoring. So we've seen that across the board as maybe some of the control activities that you used to do are not able to be done. The monitoring need of an outside view or internally just having more people involved in monitoring is increasingly important. And we can't talk about internal controls without talking about the fraud triangle. So in internal controls, our goal is not to necessarily control and eliminate the financial pressures and rationalization of people, but to actually reduce the opportunity for fraud to occur. You can't change the other two, and in fact, they've probably increased during COVID, financial pressure, as well as maybe rationalization during stressful times, unfortunately, but the opportunities need to be eliminated. So there's two kinds of controls. One is preventative, one is detective. And these essentially, like it sounds, prevent the action of fraud from occurring. And detective is more on the other side and it would catch it after the fact. And so both are needed and you have to think about a cost benefit of whether one is better than the other. So let's talk through 4 of the main areas. Cash receipts is the first one. And this kind of Mike alluded to earlier, the big change right now is just for churches, particularly during COVID, not having their count teams counting on Sunday or Monday. And so how do you make sure, essentially, the question is that donations are not being stolen, whether that's on Sunday itself or on Monday or by your staff or by your volunteers. So the goal with cash receipt controls is to protect your cash, and that includes checks, online giving, tuition, things like that. So if you have account teams that are not operating and you have staff, make sure there are multiple staff and that they are still filling out count sheets right now. That's still important. Increasing your online giving controls. So if you have switched to an online giving model, what are the options for people to add bank accounts? Is it possible for your accountant right now or yourself to add a personal bank account? What's in place to prevent that from happening? For the mail, as much as possible, limiting access to the mail and still, if possible, having 2 people involved in any mail opening processes. And with schools out there with tuitions, we just recommend any way to continue to shift families to paying online as much as possible, because that just limits the amount of cash and check handling during this time. So in online giving, obviously there's a processing fee. See if people can cover that. We definitely recommend that during this time. Now on the other side, cash disbursements would be expenditures, credit cards, wire transfers, expense reimbursements. The goal here is, how do you know that fictitious vendors are not being paid? How do you know people aren't paying themselves falsely or doing things they shouldn't be doing, using the organization's credit card for personal charges. So here, the key is reviewing and approving expenditures. That is the biggest thing right now. And so there's a lot of software options. And I've heard many clients during this time making the switch to things like Bill.com, Expensify, and even Box, where you can build, their controls are actually built into those things. So as expenditures are uploaded, they can be approved electronically, kind of moving away from the paper experience that controls have been in. So also considering banking controls. What does your bank offer to prevent fraud from occurring? Some of them offer dual authorization or positive pay to make sure that things aren't paid twice. And then, you can use emails, you can use DocuSign to provide evidence of review and approval. So, related to that is payroll. So again, how do you know that fictitious employees aren't being paid or that people aren't being paid more than they should be? This is, again, an issue of reviewing and approving. And so if you were operating under a paper-based, here's the paper report, paper timesheets, and you had to switch, how can you switch effectively? Couple things to consider: electronic timesheets, email approval, but really being careful to not send secure or to send sensitive employee information over email. So don't, send somebody's social security through email. Making use of platforms like ShareFile to ensure that information is still secure right now. And then you're going to want to also, as we'll talk about in our next session, PPP loan monitoring to make sure that that whole process and all of the expenses that apply to that were done properly. Have somebody else look at that before you submit for forgiveness. And then banking is the last area here. So this is a great monitoring tool. Having somebody besides the accountant review the bank statement, bank reconciliation, canceled check images, really just making sure that the stuff that's happening in the bank account in the month is appropriate and necessary right now. And that will kind of increase your confidence and protect you. Because again, if there's fraud, the finance department, the accountant is often the first place that the people will bring their allegations against. And so what things are in place right now for you to protect you from those allegations? Do you have somebody reviewing your work? Do you have somebody else outside of your team looking at things? These are really important. Here's kind of the last area is just the things that we have seen since March, some deficiencies or issues that we have come across. One is just lack of documentation. During March and April, nobody was documenting because it was just chaotic and there wasn't enough time to do that, but it's still really important. If it wasn't documented, it did not happen. Lack of separation of duties, where maybe one person kind of took over for a while temporarily, but really still need to maintain those two or three people. Lack of monitoring, which I've talked about quite a bit. No more mail process. We really just encourage that, kind of reinstitute the mail process in some form or fashion. And then neglecting controls for too long. So this mentality that, this is temporary, we're pausing our controls for a little bit, really isn't going to work because we just don't know how long this is going to go for. And so we just encourage you to really rethink right now and consider how can you make this secure for the indefinite future. And finally, being too flexible, not enough accountability. So hang in there, and I'm happy to take questions on this later in the afternoon session. So I'm going to pass it off to Melody, and she's going to talk about PPP.
Melanie, not sure if you're talking yet. Oh, there you are. I think you're still muted.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone being here. And I'm going to say that we've been doing ongoing presentations on PPP and the CARES Act, and some of this will be repeated information from what you may have heard in the past, but I will leave some time, especially for questions, because that's an important piece of this. And the biggest thing I wanted to note right off the bat is just kind of doing a brief.
Melody,
Yeah.
we can only see half your screen.
If you just want to go up to the top and change the presentation view that you're doing from the preview just to the presentation, Melody, up at the top.
It's not letting me do that.
You can even just leave it this way. This was
From
a little
beginning.
better.
There it
Oh,
is.
perfect.
Perfect.
There it is.
Thank you.
From a high level, I just wanted to kind of repaint where we've been and where we're going. This has been going on since the CARES Act was enacted at the end of March. Many thought that we were going to, see the end of this hopefully by summer, but it continues on, and we just have to endure and have patience and flexibility as we do that. What you can see from this, though, is it's been a very complex situation, and it's hard to keep up to date because that original CARES Act was actually the third Corona or COVID related act. The first two, one was primarily healthcare and the other was the FFCRA. But then you'll see that we had ongoing acts related specifically to PPP. Funding increased, there was a Flexibility Act increase, and then there was an extension. In this, all of us who have been in the midst of this know that things are ever changing, and it just seems like you get a handle on one thing and something else evolves. You can see that there have been 77 frequently asked questions and 24 interim final rules. Interim final rules to me is an interesting term just in and of itself, plus procedural notices. So there has been a lot of complexity to this. And the good news out of that is that a lot of it has made it simpler as we go forward, but not always. And ongoing situations with the pandemic obviously continue to add complexity to this. Overall, during the availability of PPP, there were over 5 million loans approved and over 525 billion that were given out in those loans. I know a lot of you were hoping that automatic forgiveness was going to be instituted, and what they were doing was looking at the size of the loans. And it was determined that 50,000 or less was the threshold. There's some talk that there still may be additional thresholds, but that's really unlikely. And even the 50,000 simplified, which we'll talk about in a minute, did not come in exactly as some people had hoped. There's still some steps to go through versus a simple sign-off kind of situation. The average loan size was 101,000, and there's actually very few that are over that $2 million mark that kicks you into the additional scrutiny. Right now, here's where things have stood since CARES Act. Way back in May, they started talking about a HEROES Act, and it was passed by passed by the House, but never by the Congress. They revised it in October, and then it got stalled, obviously, in a lot of the election politics and partisan kind of situations. Right now, there is nothing pending, but there is the general impression in the industry that it's not a matter of if it will happen, it's when. And it's primarily stalled by the politics surrounding things right now. So in the profession, we're calling it PPP2, although official name may be different, is likely coming, and stay tuned. I mean, we will try, as we have in the past, to do our best to provide you with the information as fast as possible in a webinar situation and other tools. This is the one where I really wanted to focus on, because obviously at this point, there's no applying for anything other than forgiveness. And how do you determine, and the big questions we get on a regular basis is, how do I decide when to file and what do I have to think about? So the first thing to consider is, have you spent the full amount? And I would anticipate, since we are now into mid-November, that the funds have been spent. The advantage with that Flexibility Act, extending the covered period from 8 weeks to 24, has allowed for greater likelihood and ease of complying with full issuance of spent. Once you've spent the funds, then you have to determine what form to use. And I'll go over those 3 forms here in a minute, and what covered period that you're going to use in filing. There's 2 covered periods. The 8 weeks, you have to have had your loan prior to June 5th to be eligible for the 8 weeks, or the 24 weeks. Now, we'll talk about in a second what happens if I use my funds at week 12 or 15, etc. We'll talk about that in a second. As I mentioned, there could be some additional forgiveness levels, but it's looking more and more remote that that's not going to happen. And another big factor here is just the timeline with your lender. I have been hearing from a number of clients that the lender portals for their particular loan are not yet available, where others have been available for quite a while. So just be aware of that. And then if you are one of those rare situations with the 2 million, when you get the instructions from the lender and you're filing within 10 days of filing for forgiveness, you're going to have to do that additional now questionnaire on eligibility. So it's wise to be looking at that ahead of time and be prepared to answer that, because you have a short window to respond. Then the other thing to consider is what expenses to use. We spent so much time up front parsing out what periods for payroll and what additional benefits and what expenses other than payroll were eligible. Bottom line is, now, for most people with the extended period availability, the recommendation is to use straight payroll. Reason being, it's going to limit the amount of documentation that you have to put together. It makes it easier for the banker, and they're appreciative when they only have to do that. And there's less just long-term documentation and other issues that you have to comply with by using that payroll. So it doesn't mean you can't still use benefits like the retirement or employer paid health care, or the other 25%, actually 40% now, the rent, interest, or utilities. It's going to be way easier to focus on payroll. And we find most people are doing strictly that. The 3 forms, the simplest is the one that came out most recently, the 3508S came out in October. And this is the one for borrowers that have 50,000 or less, unless they're part of an affiliated group. The advantage here is this is not an automatic forgiveness. There are still certifications and there is still a form to fill out, but it eliminates the need to calculate a penalty for FTE reductions and salary or wage reductions. So that's what makes this one primarily simplified. In terms of timing, this is the one that has the least complications. And for the most part, we're seeing successfully being filed at this point without any ongoing issues. So probably you can proceed with filing for that. The middle form is the EZ. And for religious organizations, the first one obviously doesn't apply. But you have to have no situations where you've reduced wages or hourly rates by 25% or more, and then that you've had no reduction in FTEs. Now, the tricky part with that FTE piece is that if you meet the criteria for some of the safe harbors or exceptions, you don't have to count a reduced FTE potentially and still be eligible for this particular application. So that may be something that you want to consider or ask the questions around. The other piece here is that caveat or carve out for part of the period not being able to operate at the same business level. If you read the instructions, it specifically lists a few federal agencies. Since there have been no federal orders, the general thinking and an adaptation of the profession has been that you have to use your state, local, or county authoritative statements in terms of business activity. The biggest things I can tell you here is keep the documentation now, because these are subject to 6-year audit, and it's going to be really hard to go back and justify it down the road if you happen to get selected at random. So it's important that you document why you couldn't operate or how that reduction in operations was an impact. Due dates, you have plenty of time. This is where we've continually been advising to just be patient, because you have up to 10 months after the last day of your covered period. So you can go, even if you've used the funds, at week 12, you can go the full 24 weeks, call that the end of your covered period, and then you still have 10 more months. So there's quite a lengthy time frame here to make sure that you've answered the questions and considerations, and that it is the best time for personal filing. Once you file, the bank has 60 days, and then the SBA has 90 days. And the important piece, like I said earlier, is keeping that documentation, because only 2 million and above are automatically going to be audited, but all of the PPP loans are subject to potential audit, and they will have that period open for 6 years. So it's important to keep not just the internal documentation, but things like why you would have had to reduce business or reasons for FTE changes, et cetera. So you want to keep all of that in mind. If you said, like we were talking earlier, if it took you longer than 8 weeks, but less than 24, you can apply somewhere in between. The thing to consider is, one, when you want that 10 months and when you want to file, et cetera, to start the clock ticking. And also, if you still think that you're going to have the potential to rehire or hit different targets with your FTE levels between now and the end of the year, those are reasons to consider potentially still going ahead and waiting. There's not, like I said, a particular rush to do this, because there are a lot of moving pieces. And I am going to leave the last few minutes here for specific questions, because this is the high level, but there's so much that's individualized. So please let me know if you have questions. Any questions?
I haven't had any come in, but if you do have any questions that follow up, please ask Melody in the breakout rooms, or make sure to shoot her an email. She'd be happy to answer those, and an awesome resource for anybody with PPP questions.
All right, great. Thank you for all those that presented and shared. We are gonna again have another session on December 10th around the same time. And so if there are any particular topics that you wish we would have covered today, we would love to cover them then. So we're still open to feedback on that. And put my contact information in the chat so you can send me an email personally if you have any specific topics that you want to cover. We just want to say thank you for coming today. And now we're going to kind of jump into some more networking time for another half an hour here. Emily, you can assign us to our groups.
Yes, 1 second,
ready.
just getting everything set up.
Thank you, Emily, also for handling all of the Zoom.
Yes, learn.
It's no a simple task. So.
All right, here we go.
Okay, thank you.